we should never forget the power contained within the jaws of the sea dwellers is enough to tear a man limb from limb. Unfortunately for some, they'll be the unlucky few who experience the true power of these predators. One such event is remembered above all else, the unfortunate story of the U.S.S. Indianapolis and her crew, who experienced the worst shark attack in recorded history. Before we begin, if you're interested in early access to videos and live chats with the creator of Intrigued Mind, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Your support will greatly help us keep the channel producing more intriguing content. Our story begins with the U.S.S. Indianapolis, a Portland-class heavy cruiser built for the United States Navy and launched on November 7, 1931. Named for the city of Indianapolis, this unique and state-of-the-art vessel served as a flagship for the commander of Scouting Force 1 for 8 years until it was called to serve in the war. On December 7, 1941, the U.S.S. Indianapolis led a collection of vessels known as Task Force 3 when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Following this, it joined Task Force 12, a specialized team that went in search of the Japanese carriers responsible for the devastating attack. The cruiser served valiantly through World War II, partaking in missions in places all across the Pacific, from New Guinea to the Aleutian Islands. It was mainly centered in the Pacific theater and saw significant action in an attempt to push back the Axis powers, specifically Japan. The vessel would serve as the flagship for Admiral Raymond Spruance in 1943 and 1944 during the height of World War II. But its most important mission would come at the tail end of the war, and ultimately, the U.S.S. Indianapolis played a significant role in finally bringing World War II to a close. With Germany's eventual surrender in May 1945, the Japanese were the only remaining members of the former Axis coalition. The Allied nations had previously offered Japan a chance to surrender or experience prompt and utter destruction, an offer the Japanese proudly refused. After receiving the Japanese's answer, the United States decided there was only one way to force a nation that could not contemplate the ignominy of surrender. So, in July 1945, the fabled U.S.S. Indianapolis was tasked with a highly secret mission to help end the war once and for all. After receiving significant repairs and an overhaul in the summer of 1945, the U.S.S. Indianapolis was given orders to undertake a top-secret mission, which was explained as of the utmost significance to national security. The crew was tasked with transporting materials, such as enriched uranium and other parts of what would become the first atomic bomb to be used in warfare, to the Pacific islands of Tinian. These components would be assembled to create the Little Boy, a nuclear weapon later dropped on Hiroshima. The contents of the secretive cargo were unknown to the ship's crew. Not even the captain himself knew what was in the cargo. However, they were heavily guarded at all times by Navy soldiers. It provided the soldiers with entertainment on their journey across the Pacific, as many of them began wagering on what exactly lay hidden in the cargo bay. The U.S.S. Indianapolis successfully traversed the Pacific Ocean under the guidance of its decorated captain, Charles Butler McVeigh, and delivered its secretive package on July 26, 1945. After this, the ship set off for the U.S. territory of the Philippines, which had been taken back from Japan, where they would meet the rest of the U.S. Pacific Fleet before a final push towards the home islands of Japan. This voyage was assumed to be relatively safe by U.S. naval commanders. However, disaster would soon strike due to a lack of communication, leaving the U.S.S. Indianapolis and her crew in a perilous position at sea. U.S. Navy chiefs were expecting Japan to surrender any day, so when the U.S.S. Indianapolis requested escort vehicles to the Philippines, their request was denied, as it was deemed a safe journey. But lurking in the waters was the Japanese submarine I-58 led by Lieutenant Commander Mochitsuru Hashimoto, and to him, the war was far from over. The Imperial submarine spotted the lonesome U.S. warship during the early hours of July 30th and immediately ordered an attack on the vessel. It fired a total of 6 torpedoes toward the U.S.S. Indianapolis, and the effects were utterly devastating. 2 Japanese torpedoes exploded directly under the ship's fuel tanks and essentially ripped the ship in two. Over 300 of the ship's crew died not long after the torpedo struck, whereas over 890 men were forced to abandon the ship. Some managed to grab a raft. However, most were simply left afloat by their life jackets. Captain Charles B. McVeigh, speaking about the fateful day some years later, had this to say. On Sunday night, the 29th of July, approximately 5 minutes after midnight, I was thrown from my emergency cabin bunk on the bridge by a very violent explosion, followed shortly after that by another explosion. I went to the bridge and noticed in my emergency cabin and chart house that there was quite a bit of acrid white smoke. I couldn't see anything. I asked the officer of the deck if he had any reports. He said, "No, sir. I've lost all communications." Within another 2 or 3 minutes, the executive officer who was second in command on the ship came up and said, "We are definitely going down, and I suggest that we abandon ship." Following the order to abandon the vessel, just over 10 minutes later, it would be submerged under the waters of the Pacific Ocean. While surviving the initial blast was seen as a lucky ordeal, what they would soon have to deal with threatened the life of every sailor who now floated in the open water. For the survivors, the nightmare had only begun. Further communication errors brought on by the ignorance of naval commanders, one of whom was drunk, assumed the minor distress signal was a ploy of the Japanese. This meant that no one in the Navy knew the U.S.S. Indianapolis was missing. For the next 4 days, the survivors would have to float above the waters without food or water under the scorching sun, a scenario many can't even imagine. As the men floated in the oil-covered water, surrounded by their injured comrades, it was no longer the Japanese that were under the water and heading for the sailors. What appeared next sent chills down the spines of even the most hardened sailors. The initial blast that tore the ship in two drew a large number of native sharks to the region. As they drew closer, they began to detect the blood-filled waters of the wounded men and the corpses of their fallen comrades. The oceanic white-tip sharks began to form circles around the floating sailors. Those who had been heavily wounded would soon start disappearing under the water in a frightening fashion, in what can only be described as a feeding frenzy of the most terrifying nature. According to eyewitness accounts of men who survived the ordeal, at times they would peek under the water and see dozens of sharks swarming the remaining crew. But the real horror began when the sharks ran out of wounded victims to prey on. This was when they decided to pick off crew members at random in an event that would continue for over 3 days. One of the survivors of the terrifying ordeal would later claim that the crew had no choice but to hope that they would not be the next to be dragged under the water. He followed it up, claiming they had no choice but to watch the sharks eat their comrades. Eugene Morgan, another survivor, went on to say the following: "All the time, the sharks never let up. We had a cargo net that had styrofoam things attached to keep it afloat. There were about 15 sailors on this, and suddenly, 10 sharks hit it, and there was nothing left." This went on and on and on. In total, estimates suggest that around 150 men lost their lives to the sharks in what is recognized as the single worst continuous shark attack in recorded history. As the sharks slowly devoured on average 50 men per day, the physiological effects also took a huge toll on the men who floated above the waters in the Pacific. Due to dehydration, a lack of food, and the glaring sun, many of the men began to hallucinate. Some believed they were walking down the grocery store's aisles. Others imagined the ship was directly below them and tried to swim into the mess hall, claiming to have a glass of milk. Some went as far as to believe other survivors were members of the Japanese army and tried to attack them. The torturous conditions continued for 4 days until salvation came on the morning of August 2nd, 1945. A U.S. Navy plane spotted the remaining crew during a routine patrol flight and immediately sent out a distress call. Only 316 of the original 1,195 men who were members of the U.S.S. Indianapolis crew would be saved when the rescue mission appeared at the scene of the terrifying wreck. With over 2/3 of the crew dead, when the news finally broke, the U.S. government and the people of the United States wanted answers. Some have claimed that the Navy needed a scapegoat as they tried to cover up the various miscommunications that first led them into dangerous waters and later halted an immediate rescue. Unfortunately for the decorated Captain McVeigh, it was he who would have to go down as the culprit. In a highly controversial event, McVeigh would be court-martialed by the U.S. Navy. They claimed the captain failed to perform evasive, zigzagging movements during times of clear visibility, which could have prevented the ship sinking. During McVeigh's trial, the Japanese commander of the submarine testified that the captain couldn't have avoided the oncoming onslaught of torpedoes. Nonetheless, in November of 1945, McVeigh was found guilty of 2 charges: failing to order his men to abandon the ship and hazarding the vessel. Ultimately, the war hero captain was stripped of his position in the Navy. In the years that followed, McVeigh spiraled into a deep depression that eventually ended with him taking his own life in 1968. However, McVeigh's name would eventually be cleared after it was later discovered that the U.S. Navy failed to share information they had about Japanese submarines in the area. A campaign was launched to clear his name, and believe it or not, he was exonerated in the year 2000 by the efforts of a 6th grader's history project. The terrifying attacks brought forth by the sharks have gone on to inspire various movies, including the 1975 movie Jaws. To this day, many agree that it is the worst shark attack in history. Let us know what you thought about today's video. Did you know of this terrifying ordeal? Leave all your thoughts in the comments section below. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel, like the video, and leave your suggestions in the comments below.